The exhaustion wasn't physical. It was a deep, molecular drain, the final leaching out of hope after 10 weeks spent holding a dying man's hand in the sterile, fluorescent quiet of a hospital room. I am Clara, 68, and the drive home from the medical center was a slow, silent surrender to the inevitability that had stalked us since Robert's massive heart attack. I had kissed his forehead, smooth and cool in the aftermath of the final machine withdrawal, and left him to the quiet mercy of the morgue attendant. My duty was done. My world was over. I pulled my old Volvo into the familiar tree-lined driveway, the late autumn air of Connecticut, smelling of damp leaves and the profound cold neutrality of endings. I imagined the house waiting for me. Silent, yes, but familiar. Ready to cradle my grief in its predictable architecture. I pictured sinking into Robert's worn leather armchair, maybe finding one of his half-finished crosswords, and simply allowing the long, paralyzing silence to begin. But the house was not silent, and it was not familiar. Before I even reached the front porch, the sight of the driveway, usually pristine, arrested me. There was a large, commercially rented dumpster parked near the garage, its gaping maw already containing a sad, colorful spill of refuse. And near the porch steps, 2 folding tables were set up, the kind we used for summer picnics. The tables were covered, not with checkered cloths and food, but with things. Robert's things. His collection of antique fishing lures, neatly arranged like dead, colorful insects. His cumbersome, beautiful set of tools laid out on a dusty canvas tarp. His heavy, beloved sweaters, the tweed, the thick blue cable knit, piled and sorted by size. And standing over the tables, talking earnestly to a young couple, examining a set of Robert's golf clubs, were my 2 adult children, Julian and Teresa. My son, Julian, 39, wore a strained, overly efficient expression. My daughter, Teresa, 42, was holding court, gesturing decisively towards a stack of leather-bound books. They were dressed in the practical, neutral colors of people conducting necessary business. They looked organized. They looked busy. They looked entirely, horrifyingly ungrieved. I stopped dead at the edge of the driveway, the car keys heavy and cold in my numb hand. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. Pure, unadulterated fury. I had been gone 10 weeks, dedicating every waking, breathing moment to the vigil, whispering promises into Robert's failing ear, washing his sheets, coordinating nurses, making the final, terrible decisions. And in the space of the 6 hours it took for me to drive home, they had invaded. I walked toward the tables, my steps slow, deliberate, each footfall a hammer blow against the thin veneer of their composure. Teresa was the first to see me. Her wide, green eyes, so like Robert's, usually so warm, flickered with a sickening blend of guilt and false relief. "Mother, you're home. Oh, thank goodness. We were just worried sick about you driving alone." She rushed toward me, arms outstretched for a preemptive hug. I held up a hand, stopping her with a gesture of cold, absolute finality. I didn't need to raise my voice. The air around me was already humming with the intensity of my shock. "What?" I asked, the single word cutting through the quiet commerce. "Is happening here?" Julian stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his efficiency armor instantly deployed. "Mom, we tried calling, but you weren't answering. We didn't want to bother you in the hospital. We just thought, look, we knew this would be overwhelming for you. We just decided to handle the bulk of the estate organization while you were focused on Dad." Estate organization. He had reduced the artifacts of his father's entire existence to a clerical task. Handle it? I walked past them, toward the tables, my eyes sweeping over the remnants of Robert's life, tagged with small, pathetic price stickers. $50, excellent condition. $10 needs polish. You are having a yard sale, I stated, the realization a bitter taste on my tongue. You are selling your father's belongings, before I have even set foot inside my own door. Teresa touched my arm, her voice dropping into a practiced, soothing coo. Mom, darling, please. We are not selling everything. Just the things Dad didn't use anymore. The tools, the golf clubs. Julian already has his own set. The old sweaters. And we're being selective. We didn't want you to have to sort through all this junk alone. It's too much of a trigger. We thought this would be a kindness. A kindness. The sheer, staggering arrogance of their presumption, the clinical detachment of their grief avoidance, was worse than any explicit cruelty. They had stripped the house of Robert's presence under the guise of therapeutic efficiency. Did they believe my love was so fragile that it would shatter at the sight of a sweater? Or did they simply believe my life was now irrelevant? I looked at the young couple now, shuffling awkwardly away from the tables, their faces embarrassed witnesses to the raw exposure of my family's fracturing. Put it all away, I ordered, my voice low and steady, laced with a threat they had rarely heard from me. Right now, every single item, off the tables and back into the house, and the keys to the dumpster. You are not to touch anything else until I have had time to breathe the air in my own home. Julian looked at Teresa, a silent, annoyed exchange passing between them. They were disappointed. They were inconvenienced. They had already mentally liquidated this portion of their inheritance. Mom, this isn't productive, Julian began, trying to pull rank with his organizational logic. We already have bids on the antique rods. If we lose the sale, you will lose more than the sale, I interrupted, fixing Julian with a gaze that finally shattered his composure. You will lose the respect of your mother. Now. Do it. They retreated, muttering, gathering the price-tagged artifacts with clumsy, resentful movements. I watched them dismantle the impromptu market, the brutal, premature post-mortem of Robert's life. I finally turned and walked toward the house, the key feeling foreign in the lock. The inside of the house was not the sanctuary I craved. It was a battlefield marked by the speed and efficiency of my children's invasion. The living room was largely untouched, but the air felt thin, disturbed. Robert's closet door, usually ajar, was wide open, exposing the gaping emptiness where his suits had hung. His shoes were gone from the entryway. Even the small, silly stack of old magazines he kept in the bathroom, the final, intimate proof of his daily routine, was missing. They hadn't waited for permission. They hadn't waited for grief. They had simply operated on the assumption of my incapacity, preemptively erasing his presence to save themselves the trouble of dealing with the emotional debris later. I walked into his study, the room that had always been his quiet, masculine retreat. The large mahogany desk was starkly, disturbingly clean. Every file, every pen, every stray piece of paper, gone. It was a void. They hadn't cleaned, they had sanitized. My anger, initially a searing heat, cooled into a hard, crystalline despair. They had not done this for me. They had done this for them. To compartmentalize the messiness of death, to liquidate the past before it could demand too much emotional reckoning. I sank onto the edge of the leather sofa, the silence of the room pressing in. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to find something, some small, meaningless item they had overlooked, something still carrying the physical residue of his existence. I looked around the room, running my hand across the smooth, cold surface of the desk. Nothing. They had been thorough. Then my eyes caught a peculiar shape half hidden beneath the lowest bookshelf, tucked into the dark crevice near the wall. It was small, dusty, and clearly missed during the Great Purge. I reached for it, pulling it out. It was heavy plastic, beige, and undeniably old. A tape recorder. Not a modern digital device, but an old-fashioned cassette recorder, the kind David had used decades ago to record musical ideas or quick voice notes for business trips. It was bulky, battery-operated, and entirely obsolete. It was probably worth nothing, which explained why Julian, the great liquidator, had missed it. I held it in my hand, running my thumb over the worn plastic casing. It felt like an anomaly, an artifact from a different, less frantic age. I turned it over. There was a cassette inside, clearly labeled in Robert's looping, confident script, CRC 10-18. CRC. Clara Robert conversation? No, that wasn't like him. And the date. October 18th. That was just 3 days before his final collapse, when he was still coherent, still speaking, still arguing good-naturedly with the nurses about the volume of the television. A surge of fearful, frantic curiosity electrified my exhaustion. Had he recorded a message for me? A final declaration of love? A last piece of advice? A tender farewell? I fumbled with the control buttons, my fingers stiff and uncertain. I pressed the small, square play button. The machine whirred to life, a low, mechanical hiss preceding the sound of his breathing. Then his voice came through, startlingly close, intimate, and entirely alive. Clara? His voice was rough, dry, strained by the tubes and the effort, but unmistakably Robert. I had to do this. I know you hate these things, but I had to be certain. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding the recorder to my ear, trying to block out the sounds of my children still sullenly moving his golf clubs from the driveway back toward the garage. I'm lying here, he continued, the sound of the hospital monitor faintly audible in the background, the steady, infuriating beep, beep, beep that had been the soundtrack of my life. And I've been thinking about the house, about the money, but mostly about the children, Julian and Teresa. He paused, a long, labored breath. The silence was agonizing. I braced myself for the paternal pride, the request for me to ensure they were cared for. They're good kids, Clara, he finally said, and I felt the small, familiar warmth of his love for them. But they're efficient, and they're fast. Too fast. They don't wait for the feeling. They rush to the conclusion. They're already talking about the estate, about simplifying your life. They think they know what's best. The tape recorder shook slightly in my hand. He had known. He had predicted the callous efficiency of their grief. I'm not worried about the money, Elle. Robert's voice dropped, becoming a low, urgent murmur, a tone reserved for deep confidences. They can have the money. I've arranged everything. But I worry about you. About me. I had dedicated my entire self to his care, and now, even in the final moments, he was worried about my capacity to survive the aftermath. They are going to try to manage you, he warned, the word manage laced with a surprising bitterness. They will try to sell this house. They will tell you it's too much for you. They will tell you that the garden is too much, that the stairs are too much, that the life we built together is now too much for your fragile, aging self. I felt a cold wave wash over me. Julian had already mentioned the need to downsize during a brief clinical phone call weeks ago. "And here is what I need you to understand," Robert continued, the sound of his breathing becoming more labored, more desperate, as if the battery was failing or his life force was thinning. "The greatest fear I have lying here is not dying. It's that you will let them. The greatest fear I have, Clara, is that you will let them shrink your life to fit their convenience." He paused. A cough, the sound of the monitor accelerating. "I need you to be selfish, Elle. For the first time in 68 years, I need you to be utterly, wonderfully selfish. Do not sell the house. Do not stop the garden. Do not simplify anything. I need you to live louder than their efficiency. I need you to defy them. That house, that life, it's not a burden. It's your anchor. It's your freedom." His voice broke, thick with emotion and effort. "I'm tired, love. I'm so tired. But don't let them silence you. Don't let them sell your anchor." Then, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The whirring of the tape recorder intensified, and the beep, beep, beep of the monitor became frantic, a blurring, insistent tone. The sound of the final minutes of his life, recorded and preserved. The message ended abruptly with a sharp electronic click. Silence returned, heavy and immense. I sat there, holding the cold beige plastic in my hand, listening to the echoing quiet of the empty study. My children's voices, muffled and distant, were still outside, arguing about where to store the golf clubs. I was no longer angry about the yard sale. The sale was irrelevant. It was merely the opening salvo in the war he had predicted. The war for my autonomy, for my right to mourn, and my right to live the messy, complicated, too much life we had built. They hadn't just sold his fishing lures. They had tried to sell my will. I walked to the window, the tape recorder clutched tight. I watched Julian and Teresa struggling to haul a heavy chest of drawers back into the garage. They looked determined, focused on the task, blind to the true, profound damage they had inflicted. I looked down at the tape recorder. It wasn't a relic of the past. It was a weapon for the future. His last wish wasn't for comfort or grief. It was an order. Defy them. How does a woman who spent her life prioritizing the needs of others find the courage to finally, violently prioritize her own necessity? I walked out of the study, the recorder hidden in the pocket of my coat, the scent of Robert's final, desperate command still clinging to the air. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the humming urgency of my new, difficult mission. The grief could wait. The fighting had begun. The confrontation over the remaining items was immediate and brutal. The atmosphere in the house that evening was thick with the unsaid, a fragile veneer of false harmony stretched over the jagged fault line of our relationship. We ate a cold, indifferent takeout dinner at the kitchen table. Julian detailed the inventory list he had meticulously created. Teresa offered banal reassurances about my need to rest. "We've made a preliminary list of the large items, Mom," Julian stated, pushing a printed spreadsheet toward me. "The heavy furniture in the study, Dad's workbench, the large library collection. These are all things that will complicate the eventual sale of the house. We should start getting professional appraisals next week." I picked up the spreadsheet, the cold, numbered precision of his language making the names of Robert's possessions look like targets. Does love become real only when it is threatened with liquidation? I looked at Julian, his face earnest, devoid of malice, merely radiating the cold certainty of his financial projections. "We are not selling the house, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but utterly firm, the tape recorder feeling like a stone of truth in my pocket. Julian frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Mom, We talked about this. It's 6 bedrooms, 2 acres. It's too much liability, too much upkeep. You can't manage the taxes alone, and the market is perfect right now. We could get you a lovely modern condo, low maintenance, closer to the city, where we can visit easily. I am perfectly capable of managing the taxes, I countered, laying the spreadsheet back down. And I am not moving. This house is my anchor. It is where I live. You may simplify your own lives, but you will not simplify mine. Teresa jumped in, deploying the soft artillery of concern. Mom, please don't be dramatic. We're just worried. You've been through so much. We don't want you to have to mow the lawn or deal with a burst pipe in the winter. It's not about us. It's about your safety. My safety, I echoed, looking pointedly at the empty space where Robert's favorite tools had been stacked just hours ago. My safety is not dependent on a reduction of my square footage. My safety is dependent on my autonomy. And I am telling you both, I am staying here. Nothing is for sale. Julian pushed back, his voice rising in professional frustration. Mom, you're not thinking logically. You can't just sentimentalize an asset. We need to maximize the liquidity of the estate, the capital gains. Robert's estate is not liquidating, I stated, cutting him off with a chilling finality. Robert's estate is me, and I am not for sale. The conversation about the house is finished. The conversation about the possessions is also finished. Every remaining item of your father's will stay exactly where it is. Julian stared at me, dumbfounded. This was not the broken, compliant widow they had expected. Why are you doing this? He finally demanded, his voice laced with wounded confusion. We were trying to help. We were trying to make this easier for you. You were trying to make it easier for you? I corrected him, standing up. The fatigue was immense, but the clarity of my purpose was a sustaining force. You were trying to skip the hard part, the part where we acknowledge his absence, one item at a time, the part where we sit in the mess of the life he left. You skipped the grief to get straight to the logistics. I will not. I walked away from the table, leaving them sitting in the stunned silence of their foiled efficiency. I carried the memory of Robert's desperate voice. I need you to defy them. I went to the bedroom, the room we had shared for 40 years. It felt vast and cold. The scent of his familiar aftershave was gone, already fading into the synthetic smell of laundry detergent. I slipped the tape recorder out of my pocket. I played his voice again, letting the desperate timbre of his last warning wash over me. I needed the sound, the absolute proof of his intent to solidify my new, terrifying resolve. He wasn't just giving me permission to fight. He was giving me motive. He had foreseen the battle for my identity, and he had armed me. I looked around the room, running my hand along the cool, smooth wood of his side of the headboard. The life we had shared was not a fragile thing to be carefully dismantled. It was a sturdy, inconvenient, glorious mess, and I was going to defend every corner of it. Is the final act of a long marriage the protection of the life that remains, or the shared acceptance of the quiet end? I knew what I had to do next. Julian and Teresa had focused on the expensive, visible assets. I needed to find the hidden things, the small, messy, sentimental artifacts that constituted the true emotional wealth of our life, and lock them away before the next wave of efficiency swept through. The cleaning had been too thorough. They had searched the surfaces. They hadn't searched the depths. I went to the linen closet, the place my mother had always advised was the safest storage for secrets. Behind the perfectly folded stacks of sheets and towels, there was a loose panel at the back wall. a small, dark space Robert had used to hide Christmas gifts and important papers years ago. I found the latch, pulled the panel away, and shone my phone's flashlight into the cavity. It was dusty, smelling faintly of mothballs, and it was not empty. There were 3 items: a sheaf of old yellowed love letters from the 1970s, our early correspondence; a small velvet-lined box containing my original wedding ring, which I had misplaced during our move 20 years ago and thought was lost forever; and finally, a small, worn, leather-bound journal. Robert's handwriting was on the cover. The garden log. I picked up the journal. Robert, the meticulous accountant, had never kept a diary, but he had kept a log of the garden, a quiet, secret record of his truest passion, the one place he allowed himself to be messy and vulnerable. This was not a financial asset. This was the buried heart of the man I had married. I clutched the journal and the tape recorder, 2 small, heavy artifacts of his final honesty. My children had sought to liquidate the marriage. Robert had given me the tools to reconstruct his soul. The real work of grieving and defiance was about to begin. The days that followed dissolved into a slow, intense campaign of resistance. Julian and Teresa hovered, disappointed and slightly baffled by my sudden, fierce rigidity. They tried to appeal to my rational side, presenting me with amortization schedules and actuarial data. I met their projections with an impassive, utter refusal. "We need to discuss the disposition of the retirement funds, Mom," Julian stated one morning, sitting across from me in the kitchen, the scent of his expensive metropolitan cologne grating against the quiet dustiness of the room. "The broker needs authorization to begin the transfer, and legally, we need to decide what percentage goes into the trust." "The funds will remain where they are for the moment," I said, folding my hands neatly on the table. "I need time to consult with an independent financial advisor, someone local." "But Mom, our firm handles the whole estate. It's streamlined. This is just complicating things." "Then let them be complicated," I said, meeting his gaze evenly. "Robert made the money over 40 years. It will take me more than 40 days to decide its future. Efficiency is not my priority right now." Did they ever stop to think that their need for speed was simply the frantic pace of people running from their own emotional responsibility? My true work was not fighting Julian and Teresa. It was reading the journal. Robert's garden log became my sacred text, the only place where his true, unguarded voice survived. It wasn't a practical gardening guide. It was a meditation on life, disguised as notes on pruning and planting. June 1988. The peonies are wilting again. I think they are too close to the main wall. They need space. They need room to breathe and unfurl, even if it means moving them when they are already established. That kind of risk feels necessary for the deepest roots. I read the entry, imagining him sweating in the summer heat, his mind turning over the needs of the stubborn flowers. Was he talking about the peonies? Or was he talking about me? About his own need for space and breathing room within the tight confines of his expectations? September 1999. The frost came early, covered the tender annuals. The hydrangeas turned blue this year. It was unexpected, given the alkalinity of the soil. Maybe the rain changed it. Or maybe it's not the soil, but the water that defines the color. We think we know the conditions, but the results surprise us. He wrote about disappointment, about the unpredictability of outcome, about the need to simply observe the color the hydrangeas chose to become, without judging it against the conditions they were given. I realized then, with a stunning, profound clarity, that I had never truly known the depth of his internal landscape. I had known the Robert who paid the bills, who offered quiet companionship, who was dependable and steady. I had missed the Robert who was intensely, silently observing the subtle shifts and disappointments of his own life, charting his emotional territory through the metaphor of the soil. The journal became my anchor, the antidote to the sterile efficiency of my children. It was a roadmap to the parts of himself he had never shown me, because he knew I was too busy keeping the house running smoothly to notice the wilting peonies. I started spending time in the garden, a place I had previously only tolerated as Robert's domain. The late autumn garden was desolate, brown, and brittle. But using the log as my guide, I could see the ghosts of his summer work. The neatly espaliered apple tree he pruned every spring, the heavy, dark loam of the vegetable patch, the massive, sprawling honeysuckle vine he trained to climb the back fence. I found the physical manifestations of his entries. I found the peonies, moved years ago, now thriving in the center of the lawn. I saw the massive hydrangea bush, its dried blossoms still clinging to the branches, the dusty, muted blue of its last surprising color. One afternoon, standing near the apple tree, I took out the tape recorder and played his voice again. "I need you to be selfish, Elle. Don't let them sell your anchor." I was no longer listening to the words. I was listening to the intent, the raw, desperate fear that his sacrifice, his 40 years of solid dependability, would be undone by my compliance. He didn't want my comfortable retirement. He wanted my revolution. The house, the garden, the messy, complicated life. These were the weapons he had left me to fight the silence. Julian tried to make an appointment with the local realtor. I canceled it myself. Teresa tried to hire an organizer to streamline the pantry. I sent the organizer away. "I need time," I kept saying, a phrase that sounded fragile, but contained the iron will of a woman finally fighting for her own air. I need time to sit in the silence, time to decide the geometry of my future. My children were frustrated, but they were no longer aggressive. They were wary. The broken widow they expected had been replaced by a quiet, implacable resistance they didn't know how to dismantle. My life was no longer about loss. It was about recovery. Recovery of the parts of Robert I never knew, and recovery of the Clara who was brave enough to stand alone and fight for the complicated mess that was her home. The final, terrible gift of his death was the necessary, frightening permission to be completely, wonderfully selfish. The true work, the slow, painful process of deciding what to plant in the rich, newly turned soil of my solitary life, had just begun.